to read the source. We're broadcasting this now. We're doing something a little different. We're inviting authors to read their own source code. Today we have Scott Corgan, who is a contributor to Superstatic. It's a static file server that that powers Divshot, and it supports stuff like HTML5 pushState applications and clean URLs, caching, and all kinds of cool stuff. So, Scott, you wanna kick this thing off and give us a tour of your project?
Yeah, absolutely. So, are you saying that I'm one of the first to go through my own source code? Is that a new thing?
Yeah, you're one of the first to go through your own source code. Yep.
Fantastic. All right. Yeah, so I guess I can share my screen. Kind of before we jump into the code, I think a background would help just a little bit, kind of where it came from. What we're doing in Superstatic is not groundbreaking. It's not even new, but the problem we face is no one was doing it yet. I work for a company called Divshot who really supports me to work on Superstatic open source. And what Superstatic is the engine that drives Divshot hosting. Almost everything that we do to run our company is open source. So technically, people could tweak Superstatic a little bit and run their own hosting. And it's just kind of cool, which also becomes one of the biggest pain points of Superstatic, as we'll see when we get into the code. But the background was one of the founders of Divshot, Michael Bly. He came to me with this idea. We're already working on something else, and he said, I want to create this static file server because I've been creating these front-end driven applications called static apps, whatever you want to call them, spas, and I have no way quickly just to get it up and running so I can not have to worry about push state and clean URLs and caching various URLs and things like that. So that was kind of the birth of Superstatic. He just basically created the README and said, here, make this work exactly how I want. And that kind of brought us to where we are today. We just released 1.0, I think, last week. And that was about 8 months coming. And I think 2.0 will actually be probably out in the next couple months. So that'll be a lot quicker release schedule as far as that. So yeah, it's just a little bit of background. You can go to superstatic.org. It basically mimics the README on GitHub, but our designer just made it look kind of legit. Should I share my screen right now? Would you like me to?
Anytime you want. Yep.
Okay.
One quick question: what's the big killer feature that you get out of Superstatic that you couldn't get from something like Apache or Nginx?
That's a good question. Well, I would say number one for me, because I've been in JavaScript so many years, is a JSON type configuration that is in your application. You can mess with anytime. But I think the number one thing, which was the biggest headache, was pushState. For whatever reason, there was no easy way to start a server that supported pushState without having to bend and go around corners, like with a .htaccess file and stuff like that. In fact, before I did Superstatic, I have a module that I've kind of told people to stop using called pushState server on npm, and basically all it does is it uses this mod rewrite module to say if it's any file except for if it's like an HTML file, or if it's any file except for HTML, rewrite it, or don't rewrite it. And so it's just this stupid hack. And but then Superstatic kind of solves all that because it's just a quick create a routes configuration and say route all routes to this file, and it's just super simple. It just works.
That's great.
Yeah. So okay, that's good. So is that so kind of I'll just share my entire screen. I think that'll be easier. Look, there you are. So yeah, you can go to superstatic.org. I mean, our designer made it look beautiful. I don't know how he does it. Or you can just go to on GitHub /divshot/superstatic. On npm, it's just superstatic. And that's where all the source code kind of relies and easy to find. So, so any questions before we kind of dive into the code itself?
How's this licensed?
Well, see, before Superstatic, open source was very foreign to me. I never worked on any project that got more than a couple stars, let alone was mattered that it was licensed. But we have MIT, I believe, in here.
Awesome.
And I'm just going to be honest. I don't know what that means, but here's what we want: is anyone can do whatever they want with it. So there you go.
Perfect.
Fair enough. So yeah, okay. Any other questions, kind of before we jump in?
Just say hi to Oakley real quick.
How's it going? How you guys doing?
Good.
Nice to meet you, Scott. I'm Oakley.
Nice to meet you, Oakley. I'm jealous of your microphone.
Oh, thanks. It's a blue. I can't remember what the name of it is. Blue Yeti.
Blue Yeti.
Yeah, they're pretty. It's pretty nice. Just a USB. It's nothing fancy. But,
Nice. Probably sounds a lot better than just the computer mic. That's okay.
I like it. It sounds more intimate, sort of.
I like it. Well, that's good. Are you guys ready to move on to the code?
Let's do it.
Yeah, man.
All right. And just so you guys know, since you called, you offered to come on and go through this code, I don't know if it's your push or what happened with us, man. We jumped about 31 stars on GitHub in that week. So that was pretty crazy. That was most that we've ever done. We've seen a lot of interest in it lately. So, but I just really appreciate you allowing me to come on and kind of expose the goodness and the badness of Superstatic. All right. So, well, first as far as it's going to start, our main file is going to be in the lib folder. We just got an index here. Personally, I'm a fan of just throwing everything in the lib folder, and if you don't have more than one file, just kind of throw in an index.js file in the root. Same with your tests. If you got a bunch of tests, throw them in a test folder. If you only got one file for testing, just a test.js. Kind of the approach I took. But everything kind of starts in this index.js file. And first, what you'll notice off the bat is this is basically just a glorified connect server. We kind of went back and forth. Do we just use raw, HTTP create server? Do we use connect? Do we use express? What would be the best approach for this? We settled on connect because it had the support for the middleware that we needed to kind of stack it. And we kind of did some performance tests with express and connect, and there wasn't really a difference. There wasn't one better than the other. A lot of our modules, as we'll see in a little bit, are standalone, so they kind of handle file serving on their own, so there really wasn't a need for something like Express. And we're even starting to see that something like Connect, the only thing we really use in Connect is its middleware stack, and we have a separate module we created to handle that anyways that kind of lets you inject middleware between other middleware and intersect the response to do various different things. So even maybe in the future we'll kind of move away from relying on that. But as we get going, kind of you'll see that this is just a basic setup file. We got these basic modules to kind of get this going with gzipping and logging, and you got to have Lodash in every project.
Yep.
And then and then we have a bunch of our own custom middleware, and we'll get to that in just a second. If you can see over on the left, we have a file called Stacker that kind of is the meat of everything. But here in the index file, we'll just kind of set up some defaults. We Superstatic can run configured in your project's root when you're going to use Superstatic from the command line. You'll have a superstatic.json file, or you'll have a divshot.json file, or you can even say, here's the file I want to use with a flag. But basically, that file is a JSON file that lets you configure different things, such as clean URLs and routes and different things like that. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. But we're just going to say we defaulted our port to something. It was 3474 was the port we defaulted to, which I have no idea why. But the higher ups, if you want to call them that, just said 3474. But you can customize your port, your host, your current working directory, the root directory, and all sorts of stuff like that. You'll see in the defaults here too have something called services, which is an awesome feature that Divshot provides that you can even use with Superstatic. That we'll talk about more, that solves things like cores in IE8 by giving you a proxy, or it lets you configure pre-render in your app so that you can be indexed for SEO value and or sending forms with no back end. I mean, one of the main driving forces behind Superstatic was to really promote the idea of what we call static apps or front-end driven applications. And but there's still some things we need to solve. And I think we did a good job in Superstatic. But yeah, not much going on. So we we create the Connect server and kind of push in the defaults. We kind of one mistake I made that I haven't been able to fix yet, just for time reasons, was I kind of just attached all these options to the server object or the application object, which I think is caused some headaches, as we'll see in a little bit as well. But we just kind of create our server. You're going to see a lot of these weird if statements and things that seem unuseful, like this prepend method. Why wouldn't you just use the middleware, .use? But what we have to remember as we go through this code is it's a Superstatic is a single tenant module for single applications. The problem we have to solve using Superstatic is that on Divshot we're multi-tenant. We have multiple applications running, and we have to be able to configure it on the fly to let Superstatic serve it. And so we have to, prepend and append all these different extra modules before and after what Superstatic does for our own personal use in Divshot. So we got this kind of hidden prepend method that just you can kind of inject this like middleware stack before everything happens. So not much to really worry about there, but yeah, just typical basic stuff. We got flags for debug. To let you, show or hide when you're using Superstatic in the command line. Do you want to see the login or not? Query parser. Kind of something we got going on here. You'll see a lot around Superstatic is, I don't know if you know the guys from Carrot, but they have the module roots, and which is a big static module, and they were using Superstatic for a little bit, but they needed some stuff in it that we didn't provide yet. So we worked pretty closely with them to come up with all these different kind of features that they needed. And one of the things that they found really helped actually for performance-wise was throwing these if statements in here to add or remove these middleware modules. And I was surprised at how significantly the performance increase was. If we got at the most basic use case for Superstatic, if you have nothing in your configuration, it runs at a certain speed, and if you configure everything, it's up to 30% slower. Now we don't see those performance degradations, in production because we got a CDN in front of Divshot, but it's amazing how these little tiny if statements you'll see all over Superstatic for the modules really help. Now, not this one specifically, because this is actually helping optimize it, but as we get into the stacker file, you'll start to see that. Another thing we need to accomplish with Superstatic, because of how we're using it in production with Divshot, was to be able to inject our own custom routes, to be able to do different things. Like when you deploy an app to Divshot hosting, we need to invalidate the cache. So we need to set a route that lets the API call our hosting to handle the cache invalidation, and the way we're using Superstatic in production, we need to be able to inject these custom routes. Nothing crazy there. So I'm not going to go line by line through everything, but this is the file that sets everything up. So I kind of wanted to go a little more detail into it. You're going to see right here, this is probably the ugliest thing we have in the entire, not right there, right here. These two lines mimic each other. It's the ugliest thing we have in the entire application. If this environment variable called site is set, we configure our application's settings at different times. And the reason why is it's really difficult to test a hosting environment on your local machine, as opposed to testing it on a machine that actually has the DNS server set up and everything like that. So like I said before, we've got a lot in this code that that doesn't necessarily need to be in here to make Superstatic work. And we're slowly figuring out ways to get rid of these extra little artifacts inside of Superstatic that we use for our own personal use. But for now, you just got to deal with it. So I'm going to jump into this listen function. But any questions on any of that? It was kind of more detailed than mattered. But
how do you actually test this? Test the hosting environment?
Man, it's really so we had a setup to where we would run our API locally, we would run our cache locally, we'd run our file server that would actually serve the files locally. Our file deployer we'd run locally, and our database would be local. We'd be able to do all this stuff, but it got so complicated that it would only work on one person's machine and not someone else's. And it really has to do with the DNS. So there's a lot of tweaks, and right now I think there's only 2 people at the company that can actually test this on their local machine, and I'm one of them because of the tweaking that happens. We do have a staging environment, but we literally have to mimic our entire production, every single server, in order for all of it to work together, which is kind of a shortfall we found in these kind of service-oriented architectures. Is having to have all of them run. Now a lot of that's our fault because we could probably architect a little better, but right now it just has to be ugly because we're a startup. We're trying to get to a point where we're sustainable, and so we have to do what we have to right now.
What would you? Sorry, this is Eric Scott. What would you do to change the code if you could go back?
Well, I don't have to go back because I actually have I don't have a branch on here. I have it locally. I'm working on something called Superstatic Reloaded that kind of solves. I'm looking at I have every single headache documented in Superstatic, and I'm really thinking it through and writing tests on how to solve these types of situations for using it how we do in production, so that we don't have to have any of these artifacts from Divshot hosting in an open source project like this. Because I'm sure when people look through this code, they're like, what does this even mean and why is it here? But I guess the good news of having a not as popular module yet is not as many people are asking that question. So does that answer your question, Eric?
Sorry, yeah, I was on mute. Yeah, I think that answers it. Yeah, I mean, because Christian and I, we talked about this before. We were on the Static Showdown, which was a great hackathon that you guys did in February, and you made it mandatory that everyone use the Divshot CLI, and I really enjoyed it. And we got to look at other solutions since then, and I keep looking back at this, and I think that you have the best well-rounded solution in general. So I just wanted to see how you would want to improve it.
Okay, yeah, I forgot that was your question. What I said before was a prequel, but I appreciate those compliments. That actually means a lot. But how we would improve it, I think one of the things we're throwing around is, the assumption is that whoever's going to use this has npm and Node installed on their computer. And I mean, that's all fine and well, but most people that have that on their computer aren't really doing any kind of static development front-end stuff. The majority of those people are Node developers. And that's already a hurdle we found, because then we have to, we're doing customer support on walkthroughs on how to install Node and NPM, which is kind of a headache. So I know that, one of our founders, Michael Bly, he's been really heavily getting into Go, kind of something we talked about before we got on air. And, he's even talking about what if we can compile this into something like Heroku has, where you can just install it and it doesn't need Node. But I would say that's probably our biggest headache, and something that we would change is, we would definitely still have an open source project such as this to use in your applications, maybe in Node, but the CLI tool would definitely, for Superstatic, and even the Divshot CLI would definitely be something compilable that doesn't have any other requirements outside of itself. So I think that's probably a better answer to your question.
Cool.
So I'm not that familiar with Divshot. Could you give sort of the 10,000-foot view of what Divshot is and sort of how Superstatic was built to support it, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good question. I assumed, but I apologize. So Divshot's about 2 things. Static web hosting for stuff like single-page applications or even static sites, and web components. Okay. And so the main driver of our business model is the static hosting, providing support, CDN-driven static hosting that gives you custom environments, so you can have a staging and a development environment. You can promote those environments to production, and the sorts, and providing services that solve some of the no backend mindset type of problems like forms and proxies and stuff like that. But the other thing we're kind of about for Divshot is web components. We have a huge push. We've launched a couple sites like le.io, that's ele.io, that's a web component builder, kind of like JSBin or JSFiddle. And we built something called builtwithpolymer.org that kind of showcases web components. So that's kind of a higher level view of what we focus on as a company.
Cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah.
I played with Built with Polymer. There's some great stuff on there.
Yeah. Jake Johnson, he did a phenomenal job. One of the guys that I work with, one of the founders. So, all right, any other questions? Kind of before I move on.
Let's do it.
Good to go.
Right. Cool. So yeah, not much going on in this listen function. Kind of what I wanted to do was kind of mimic kind of Express's listen and close function. I mean, this is typical, trying to read the number of arguments. And then, but this takes us, what's important is this takes us to the meat of how Superstatic works, and it's this stacker middleware, which is actually itself is a collection of middlewares that get run per each application request. And we've gone back and forth. Originally in this listen function, we had our entire stack of middleware to parse the clean URLs and the routing and the caching and the headers and stuff like that, all in this listen function in the app.uses. But what we started to realize is we had to do some crazy custom stuff, like I said before, for the multi-tenant requests. We're getting requests through Superstatic for multiple different applications in our production environment. And so the solution we came up with is on each request we would build the middleware stack, which is basically building the custom application stack on each request that would resolve each file. And one of the things that kind of kept me from doing that originally was for performance reasons, because it doesn't make sense to execute all this logic and create all this overhead in each request. But I did some good benchmark tests, and we didn't really lose any of the optimizations we had made before that. And I'll show you what these dynamic stacks look like. So in fact, I'll open up that file now, and we'll kind of get. So if you look back in the index.html file, we got this app.use, which is basically putting a middleware into the Connect server, and this stacker file is just a bunch of stack.use, stack.use, stack.use. So each request, this file gets executed. And I know some people are going to hear that or see that and just think, man, that's got to be the biggest performance degradation there could possibly be, but you'd be surprised that it isn't. We really didn't lose that much performance stacking it on each request. And so it really made things easier, because what I can do then is, you see all these up here, these requires, these are all our middlewares that are actually the meat and logic of Superstatic. Obviously, this is someone else's module, Surf Favicon. You guys have probably seen that one. And but stuff like redirects, which handles configurable redirects, which Superstatic supports, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Static router, handling routing, static routing, saying I want these URLs to serve these files. The clean URLs, removing the .html off of a URL, which is, Jekyll solves that by making all these directories with index.html files. But we're like, what if you don't have to do that? What if you can just create an HTML file anywhere and it just looks nice? Setting headers, custom not found pages, and stuff like that. How do we handle trailing slashes and stuff like that? So before we dive more into this stacker file, I wanted to go back and kind of show you the features that Superstatic provides, so that stacker file will make a lot more sense. The simplicity of running a static file server, typing SS in whatever your application's directory is just beautiful. It's just so easy. It's very configurable too, setting the port and the host, whatever you want. But here you start to see how useful configuration for Superstatic is in like your superstatic.json file or divshot.json file. You can set whatever root directory you want. A lot of people, they have these crazy build systems, and they build and concat everything into a dist folder or into a _site folder if it's a Jekyll site. And so you can set whatever your root of whatever directory you want to serve. You just set it in the root, and everything becomes relative to that. Very simple. For clean URLs, if you set it to true, it's going to remove the .html off every URL, which makes your URLs look beautiful. In fact, right before we got on this call, I pushed out a new feature that lets you provide an array of globs to say, serve these sets of files with clean URLs and not these sets of files. And those are actually, we haven't pushed it live to the website, but that's in the GitHub README. Here's the most beautiful thing about Superstatic is routes. And again, I'm going to go through these quick, but the reason I'm showing you those so the code makes more sense is you can create these globs and say, if the URL matches this, serve this file. And the most basic one is just a **, and that just serves one file for every HTML request. Just a beautiful piece of it. And that's actually a module on NPM called static router, as we'll see in a moment. You can set up redirects, and the beauty of it, you can set up segmented redirects. So if you get a URL that matches this path, it'll redirect to URL matching that path and use whatever segment was in there, which is really helpful in a lot of situations. You can provide a custom error page which shows, on a 404. You can set custom caching for different, use globs to set different custom caching. You can set custom headers if you have JSON files that, for whatever reason, need CORS support. You can put all that stuff in yourself. And then here we don't have documented yet because they're still in beta called services, and I had mentioned them earlier. The idea of being able to submit forms for a front-end only application, or make CORS requests in IE8 through a proxy, and we'll look at that more in just a little bit. But those are kind of the main features that Superstatic provides as far as a module that can serve static files. So, but with that understanding kind of how Superstatic works, a lot of these modules will start to make more sense. And one of the headaches we had, and we have integration tests for this and a lot of unit tests, is the ordering of the modules is so important. If one module comes after another module and that's wrong, then all of Superstatic won't work correctly. And I don't think that's a fragility in the code or bad code. It's just the idea that, if someone has a URL for a specific static file, that trumps a certain other module, like what was the one that it trumps? I don't remember which one it trumps, but we'll get into that. So, but yeah, just a typical. I'm a huge fan of. I love when I open a node file and I see all these requires. That's my favorite thing because I know that the code is going to be easy to read because they abstracted a lot of what they did into other modules, and I'm thankful for that. Some of them we couldn't abstract. Like we've got this module here we'll look at in just a second about loading environment variables, just because it wasn't useful to anyone else. So we made the decision, let's keep it in this module, the Superstatic module, without abstracting it to its own custom module. Because you hear a lot about little tiny modules that do great things on their own, one little tiny thing great on their own, but sometimes it's not useful to anyone, so there's no point in abstracting it. But we made decisions to abstract to other ones. We do provide in Superstatic a default error page if you don't provide one. It's just it's not the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, but it's there in case you don't provide one. But here's that stacker function that we saw in the index.html file right here. Here's where it all starts, and here's the beauty of it. I use this module called stacked, and we're actually moving away from that because this is such an integral part to how Superstatic works. We wanted a module under our own umbrella so that we could tweak it how we needed. So we have a new one called bundles that isn't integrated into this branch of Superstatic yet, but it is locally on my machine that allows you to inject other middleware before and after middleware, named middleware, and it also lets you intersect the response and the requests streaming objects so that we can really get rid of all this extra cruft and artifacts left over from what we have in production, as we saw in the other file. But basically what this module does is it emulates, connects, and expresses middleware stack. And what it does is it returns a single middleware that when called in the stack, it just executes its own middleware. So you can create stacks of stacks of stacks, which gets really helpful when trying to abstract very kind of, what am I trying to say? Very complicated stacks in your middleware. So we do basic things. I'm going to come back to this right here. These middleware options are actually also corrupted artifacts left over for how we use this into production, because I have to pass these overrides into each of our modules. The reason for that is Superstatic, it serves static files that are local to wherever Superstatic is running. So you could technically run Superstatic on Heroku, which is a horrible idea because it's very expensive. In fact, we have a blog post on Divshot that kind of tells you why it's not a good idea. But it serves the local files wherever Superstatic is running. But what we're doing with Divshot is we've got the files hosted remotely. We've got to, kind of proxy those through Superstatic. So one of the things we had to solve was, how do we serve local files and how do we serve remote files? And it was a real headache we've kind of had to solve. And I'm yet to have anyone kind of say, hey, I know a way to do this because we've solved it, or I know a better way. And I would love input from anyone that knows how to handle those types of situations. But I feel like we've done a pretty good job doing typical mix-ins and overrides with these two functions that basically kind of tell if the file exists and generate the full path. Those are the only two ones we really needed to override. And what kind of we're doing here is we have a store provider which basically serves the file. So we have a local store and we have a S3 store, and we have them over here in these right here in these folders. And what the local store does is basically just handles if it was running locally, so files on your local file system. But what the S3 store does is it has to handle things differently. It has to read an array of files and determine they're actually hashed files because they're stored all over the place. That's for optimization, and for if you look at the Divshot CLA nowadays, when you're pushing up to Divshot hosting, it doesn't push all your files. It does hashed kind of caching, so it only pushes the files that changed, which got really complicated in Superstatic. So we had to create these file store providers that allowed us to pass into each of these modules in our stack and let them decide, how do we determine if this file exists, or how do we generate the full path of this file so we know how to serve it. So again, these kind of artifacts left over for how we use this in production, and I'm really excited to see where this goes in the future. So moving down to our middleware stack, our very first one in our middleware stack is these things called services. If you go into NPM, you can, if you search for the word Superstatic, you're going to see a lot of things show up because we like to tag everything that Superstatic uses. But three of them that show up are Superstatic Proxy, Superstatic Pre-Render, and Superstatic Forms. And these are services that you can use with Superstatic. You can read the documentation on how to use those. And they solve various problems that front-end applications with no back-end have, namely sending forms from a contact page. That's a service, and we provide that, and you can make post requests to that URL, and you can create handlebar templates, and it'll parse it for you, and it'll send it to wherever you want, and it's just really cool. But this is probably the beefiest module we have in the entire system, simply because in your superstatic.json file, which is your configuration file, you have to define how you want these services to work. And so we have to go through and we have to parse all this information, and we have to determine, is this an actual service, or are they trying to hack into our flow here? And I don't really want to get into the services one deeply. Just know that this module does a lot of parsing and kind of handles these crazy custom requests for these services. And if you want to go look into it more detail, maybe after I'm done, maybe we can do that then. But that's not even a fun one to look at. That's actually a huge headache. Moving forward, we've got this middleware redirects. It does exactly what you think, but it's this module we were able to abstract called redirect, and I was really excited when we were able to extract it because I can use this in other applications. It's basically a middleware for Connector Express that says, here's a glob. If it matches this, redirect to this URL. And it's really awesome. As we saw earlier, you can do custom status codes if it's only a temporary redirect. You can do segmented redirects that translate that segment. And in the superstatic.json configuration file, you can define all this under the redirects key, so that when a request comes in, one of the first things it parses is the redirects here. And if it matches a redirect, it doesn't go past this middleware. It stops there and it redirects, and then the request happens all over again once it redirects to the URL. And it's become very useful. Again, like I said at the beginning, this isn't anything groundbreaking. This is just super simple middleware, but no one had put it together, so we solved our own problem. And lo and behold, a lot of people are having this problem because Superstatic's really starting to take off. And this redirects middleware, there's nothing really fancy about it. If we go into the code here, it's basically using a module I have called globject. It treats an object of globs as if it were an object. So as you saw right here, I mean, we've got these globs. This isn't a glob itself, but it could be. So if you say, I'm calling this key, and it kind of is a replacement for something like weak maps or something that's coming out in ES6 that allows you, I think it's weak maps, that allows you to use other things besides a string as the key of the object. It basically, and a lot of our modules use this, it just parses that out, and if the request matches that redirect, it handles it and it serves it right here. That's it. Super simple. It just kind of, if not, it just moves on right here. Nothing crazy. And a lot of our modules look like this. If it happens, do it. If not, move on. And a lot of them are parsing glob-driven objects that, so we created this globject module that really helped us kind of to deal with it. And you're going to see this module around a lot. It's called Slasher. Basically, this isn't groundbreaking either, but it solved a problem that I had. Was there's other modules that add a slash to the beginning of a string, but there's no modules that added a slash to the beginning of every key and value in an object. And because we're parsing URLs, we want to make sure they're all pretty much the same. So if you know that your configuration is going to be relative to your root directory, whatever you set it as, if it's the current directory or you set it as a different one, we need to make sure that if you forgot to put the /, it still works. So you're going to see this module around a lot, and it just kind of adds a slash either to the beginning of a string or to the beginning of the key and values in the object. So before I move on, I've said a lot, I've talked about a lot. We're going to go through the other modules quicker. Were there any questions kind of on any decisions we made in the stack or how we do our modules up to this point?
Not particularly. It's a good explanation.
No, so far.
Very clear, actually. Well-written code too. I can follow it without breaking a sweat. I'm amazed at the number of details that are involved in this, though. You think of serving static files, and it's like, screw it. It's like a little static file server. But there's really a lot of weird little edge cases that you guys are covering. It's impressive.
Well, yeah, I wonder too, like if you have this in a production level where you're supporting a lot of different static applications all at once. Like, is there a way for the rest of us to configure something like that?
You know what? There, in the Superstatic that I'm working on locally, that kind of, as I said towards the beginning, solves a lot of headaches we have in this current Superstatic. What I realized is that Superstatic becomes more useful as a middleware itself, either for Connect Express or raw HTTP server, than it is a server itself. Because what you can do with that is you can pass into Superstatic a configuration instead of parsing the configuration in Superstatic. So, we see all these weird things like exists and full path, but what if all that stuff was calculated outside of Superstatic and then passed into Superstatic, which would make what you want to do, serving multiple, static sites or applications, a lot easier. Right now, that's why you see a lot of what we have is because it's inside Superstatic that parses this. So to answer your question, there's not a lot you can do besides override these types of functions, if you look into the store and the settings files here, which really do a lot of the multi-tenant parsing, if you kind of see what we're doing there, if you mimic that and you can pass that stuff into Superstatic, you'll be able to do multi-tenant serving. But I wouldn't recommend it, and that's why we offer our hosting services so that you don't have to. But,
yeah, it sounds like a lot of work and a lot of maintenance.
You know it is, and that's why we have a lot of tests around it. But that's why we also broke out the modules, is so those tests would be their own environment. But you know, it really was when we first started. We're just like, this is going to be simple. We're just going to serve static files. If it matches this route, serve this file. But I think 8 to 10 months later, we're looking through the code right now, and it's just like, look at all the edge cases, and it's kind of sad that it's this difficult to serve static files. But it is. And that's kind of where we are in web development. You know, the usual, it's got to be more difficult than it really is type of scenario. So.
Cool. Thank you for answering that. Is there a way so we can see the code a little easier because of the resolution?
Yeah. You know what? I didn't even think of that. I apologize. So is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. If it's not better, just let me know. Just interrupt. If I need to make it bigger, I can make it bigger. So, can you guys see that better?
Yep, very clear.
Okay.
It's funny, there's so few lines of code that I can follow along pretty easily in my IDE over here.
That's good. Yeah, well, there's actually a lot of lines, but then we were able to abstract them.
Right, per file, I mean.
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying. So, yeah, I remember, I forget his name, but him and his wife, they're both developers. I think they run something called Charm. Thomas, I don't know how to say his last name. But anyways, he said something one time that stuck with me years ago that, you know, if your file gets over 100 lines, you should break it apart. And I don't follow that strictly, but it really helps in things like this, in code reviews and such. So moving on. So redirects is our number one. The other thing we were having issues with is a slash at the end of the URL. And this doesn't seem like a big deal. Most people would like either keep it or take it away. But it's not necessarily that simple, because if we took it away on every URL, that means any relative URL in your static files, we would have to figure out if you meant for it to be relative to that URL or relative to the root of the application. Because a lot of people are used to just putting relative URLs to the domain, and they're parsed to the domain instead of to the actual path. And so what we've decided to do in this module is that we remove the trailing slash in every URL except if it's a directory index file. So if we're serving an index.html file for that directory, we keep that slash on there because we remove index.html with clean URLs, and we keep the slash there so that we can parse relative URLs correctly. And it's not that big of a deal, and it's kind of a high-level explanation, but this is one of our biggest, this is our second biggest module after services. Because of the type of parsing, this was our biggest headache out of almost anything we had to deal with. And if you look at this module, it's not as big here because we've done a lot more abstraction into something like this module called file exists and other things like that. But we've got to do some not necessarily monkey patching, but we've got to jump through some hoops in order to know if we should leave a slash or remove a slash. And one of the main reasons is because of the clean URLs, where we remove the extension or we remove the index.html at the end of the URL so it looks like a more beautiful URL. But moving on back into the stacker function, after we look at redirects and slashify, we have this module that provides basic HTTP authentication. What's cool for this, with Divshot hosting, through the CLI, you can say, I want to protect this environment with a username and password so that I can send it to my client and only they can see it if I want them to. And you can remove that protection, but we got to be able to parse those headers. Again, passing in our settings object that I kind of alluded to earlier, because it does a lot of kind of weird kind of configurations in order to handle multi-tenant use. So we have to use our settings here to parse our build environment for the multi-tenant use. So not really anything pertinent to someone using Superstatic, But again, more stuff that we have to inject into Superstatic for our own use, but that won't be there in the future.
It's is this similar to the basic auth for Connect?
Yeah, well, in fact, we're going to be using basic auth in the future. This was more of a test to see if we had to parse the username and password from the user's configuration that is brought down from our API in the Divshot hosting. But yeah, it's exactly the same thing. In fact, once I wrote this and we launched it into production, I forgot about that module and I had looked at it and I was like, this is just doing everything I just wrote. Kind of one of those kind of face palms. But for now, it's
learned a lot along the way.
That's exactly it, you know. But you know, I've started to see modules like Happy start to incorporate their own versions of modules that already exist for the sake of having full control over it, which is an interesting take. I know that they're more enterprise, but we've really started to research, you know, is that something that's best for something we need complete control over? So go ahead. Oh, I thought someone was going to say something. All right, moving on in the stack, our next thing we need to configure is the headers. What response headers do we want to set coming back? So technically, you can customize any header you want in your superstatic.json file in the headers key. You can make it say whatever, and it's all glob driven. So if you want this set of files to have these sets of headers, and whatever you would want to do. But this is really helpful if you want to get down to the nitty gritty. Most people won't use this configuration for headers, but it's just there if you want it. And next comes the fun one that most static file servers and people providing static file hosting don't provide, and that's complete control over caching. Basically, per application in your superstatic.json configuration file, you can say, I want this set of files to have these caching headers. So you can have no cache on some files, or you can have crazy year-long caching on other files. And this this caching module is available on NPM as well under cache control. That's not how you spell it, though. Makes it really simple to use. So basically, you're just passing in globs here and setting. If you put a number, it sets the max age for you. If you set false, it just says no cache. If you put a string, it puts in the header whatever you put into it. So it parses it all for you. It makes it really simple if you want to add any type of caching to any type of application. It doesn't necessarily even have to be a static application with Superstatic. But you can look through the code in this module. It's nothing super crazy. Again, we're probably parsing. Here, I'll open it up for you guys. We're setting headers on headers, and we're just parsing whatever's in that that object. You know, again, we're using the slash module to add the slashes. We're using we use minimatch to parse the globs, and yeah, nothing crazy. But one thing I did wanted to point out is, I don't know if you noticed in all our modules, we're not using the native URL module. We're using this one called Fast URL Parser, which you may have heard of. I mean, it's kind of popular, but it actually gave us a 30% performance increase throughout our entire application by using this module instead of the native URL parser. And don't ask me why. I'm not that smart of a developer. It worked, so I did it. And all our tests passed, so we're good.
Damn, I was hoping you'd have an answer for that one.
I have no clue. You're welcome to look through their source code. But,
for sure. I definitely will.
Yeah, it's really helpful. So yeah, back to the stack. So after we've cached, we have this thing. We have these environment configuration values, which is a genius thing that one of the guys I worked with came up with. And basically, if you have like a .env file locally and you're using Foreman, you can load these values, and you can use the .env module on npm to load these values as well. But we wanted to provide a way for front-end applications to have environment-level configuration values, meaning on staging, I want these values. On production, I want these values. And in the back end, that's really easy because you can set it onto the process environment. But on the front end, you don't really have that available to you. So what we've done in this module, we can go take a look at it, is we've provided a way that if you make a request to something like this, it's we've reserved the underscore underscore for anything that Divshot does in your URLs. But if you make a request to this in your Divshot application or even in your Superstatic application, this is going to return a JSON formatted set of values that if whatever you either put into your you can put a file like this into your root app directory with Superstatic, and in this file it's just a JSON file with key values, and if you call this URL it'll load it for you, which makes it super helpful to, I mean you could do this yourself with other things, but it makes it super helpful in Divshot hosting because through the CLI you can set these values and we store them for you, and you can call them on, you can make the same JSON call in any environment and they'll return those environments values. So if you're in the staging environment, you'll get that set of values. Maybe you're using a staging API, and so you'll call the right API. It's been really, really helpful. We also provide, as you can see right here, we do this regex matching. You can also call underscore underscore env.js. And what this does, it returns something really helpful. If you're using something like require.js, it will detect that, and you can now just do like you can now just require in your require.js the env, and it will return those values for you. Something like a browserify as well, it'll detect if there's a require method available, and it'll make it available with require. And if not, it just puts it on the object under window.__env. So you have available to that globally. It's a really cool solution to a problem that back-end people take for granted and that front-end people don't have.
So you're saying that would enable you to use browserify with your applications?
No, well, basically, if you are requesting the env.js file, it allows you to incorporate it more easily into things like Webpack and Browserify and require.js. There's still a little bit of hoops you need to jump through because you're requiring a separate script. But however you would incorporate an external script, like it detects which type of require method is available, and it makes that so you can require it. So that you can require these types of variables into your application. It makes it really cool. In fact, someone just put out a blog article, I think that Divshot tweeted out, about how to use these configuration variables with Webpack. And there's a little bit of hoops, but we're working on something with Superstatic called piggybacking that allows you to run Superstatic as a proxy to another server underneath. So something like Middleman or Roots, so that when you make a request, Superstatic will parse which file needs to be requested, but then it will call whatever's underneath, and that will return whatever file your build is in. And that's a whole other talk to do, but just know that these environment variables are phenomenal, and they're really helpful. So here, we can jump down here, if it's a JSON file, we're going to set the payload type and set what type of information to return. It's a typical middleware, nothing crazy. Again, we have these artifacts or cruft left over from what we need to do to parse for multi-tenant. We need to look at the build for the current application's request and parse the environment information. And we actually do that with Superstatic if you're serving local files. We actually build a mock configuration so that it can work exactly how Divshot uses it in production. So,
and Scott, are you sorry, are you supporting HTTPS and content security policy?
Yeah. So if you come back into our index.html file, something we didn't get to is right here. Because stuff like Express and Connect support serving this over HTTPS, if you just use the secure value when you're, because you can use Superstatic programmatically as well, not just from the command line. We had a request for this, so we implemented it, and it just lets you, serve it over HTTPS. And we haven't gotten far into handling, different security things. Like the module helmet provides a lot of help in the cross-site request forgery type of things. We haven't gone deep into that because we handle that in Divshot in production, but we assumed that that's out of the scope of Superstatic itself. We're here to serve the static files. We'll let whoever is using Superstatic programmatically to handle those. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
We've really had to set a hard line to not provide every single piece of functionality you use. And it's been helpful to not have scope creep. So, all right. So moving on from the environment variables, the next item in our stack is the clean URLs. And these are actually really cool because I don't really like the way Jekyll handles it. When you compile a Jekyll application, it creates directories and directories and directories in order to have these beautiful looking URLs that you would normally do in like a PHP application, use your .htaccess file, do all these parsings or whatever you want to do, you know. But clean URLs, basically what the clean URLs do is just it detects if it's an HTML file and it removes the .html extension with a redirect. And again, this is also a module if you want to use it on NPM, just called clean URLs. And I just pushed an update out to it today, 3 hours ago. It said basically it's just a middleware that you can throw in that that if you don't provide anything here, it's the same as in your configuration file saying true, and then it'll just treat every HTML file or every request URL that ends in .html will just redirect to the non-HTML version. But you can also do, again, put an array of globs in here that allows you to say, I want these sets of files. Because one of the things we found is, since we're big on web components and Polymer, we were getting a bunch of redirects when we were, you know, importing web components. So if I'm importing polymer.html, it's redirecting to just /polymer. And that's just this unnecessary redirects that we don't need. So we introduced these globs here. And we can take a look at what that module looks like. It's, again, nothing super crazy. But we come in here and it just does a lot of parsing. Again, we got a bunch of modules just to parse clean URLs. But one of the headaches we had is that, again, we have to parse remote URLs from a file list as opposed to a local file system. So basically, in this clean URLs middleware, we don't want to do anything if it's the home URL. We just kind of move on. There's nothing to do there. We detect if the extension is .html and it matches the rules that you passed into the module, which is also in your configuration file. And if it does, then we're going to redirect it as a clean URL. So, you know, if we come up on something like about.html, this is going to be redirected to about. That's basically what that looks like.
How does it handle like in Polymer? You'll have, and web components in general, you'll have the HTML imports, but they get imported by the main file usually, or you know there's some large vulcanized HTML file. You don't want it to be a route. How does that work? Maybe I just didn't see that.
So really, Polymer actually handles that because once it comes into Superstatic, Superstatic only sees it as just as a request. So it can come in as, you know, Bower components / Polymer / Polymer.html. Like it can come in as that URL, and that's all that Superstatic's going to see. But the reason, as I just mentioned before, today we launched the support for the array of the strings of globs to say, because what if I don't want anything inside of Bower components to be redirected as a clean URL, but I want everything inside of, you know, my at folder to be redirected as a clean URL? So you can put a glob in your configuration, like you do something like this, you know, and then everything inside of your Bower components folder won't get redirected as a clean URL. So it'll just be handled naturally, and and then nothing's different as far as Polymer or if you're vulcanized and stuff like that is concerned. So does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, perfectly. Thank you.
Okay. So again, we move down. Once it's redirected, it's going to make its way and sift its way back through this middleware. We want to detect, is this a clean URL? And that's where the parsing gets really difficult, because we need to see, one, does this URL resolve to a file if we add a .html extension? Two, does this clean URL, is it actually a directory that resolves to an index.html file? So we have to jump through all these hoops and do a lot of this parsing, which we kind of do down here. And this isCleanURL function does that parsing. It detects if this file exists, which is a module I wrote, which basically wraps the .exists sync function and isFile function. That's all it is, basically. And so I didn't have to reuse it in all the different, or redo that same line in all the different modules we use this in. But it basically says, does this match the rules that it passed in, those globs, and does the file exist? And if it does, then serve that clean URL, which is back up here. And if this is not a clean URL and it's made it this far, that means this module has nothing left to do and it moves on. If it is a clean URL, it has to do this fun little join that we have in like all of our modules. Because remember, towards the beginning I mentioned you can set your root directory. So if your root directory is not the current directory, it may be a dist directory or a _ site if you're using Jekyll. We have to parse relative to that root directory. And again, because we're using this in production and we're using remote URLs for Divshot that we have to proxy to the browser, we had to write a custom module called join path, which is awesome. And I'll show you that module because this solved every headache I ever had in the past couple of weeks. It lets you join paths with undefined values and lets you join paths even if it's a URL. So under the hood, it's using a couple different modules, the native path module and one called URL-join. And it just figures out if it's a URL, use this module to combine it. If it's not a URL, it's just a regular path, combine it. And it maps through, and if it finds any undefined values, it handles those. That way we don't have these headaches when we're joining the root to the path name if something's blank. Now, man, in production, we've seen so many exceptions thrown of these edge cases that you had mentioned earlier that we did not think about. So again, kind of parsing different things, and you'll start to see this module. We can kind of skip past this. It's nothing important to you guys, but you'll start to see this deliver module, and this is another module we had to write in order to serve either a static directory or a remote directory. And I'll show you this one, and it's pertinent to Superstatic. Because check out what it does. If you say your root is a local directory, it'll just serve static files. It uses underneath, it uses the send module, which is what Express uses. But for root, if you provide a URL, it now becomes a proxy. And kind of like
that's cool.
the HTTP proxy, which solved a big headache we had. Because again, if you're using Superstatic yourself locally, local files, but we're in production, we're proxying remote files. So this is we don't have time to go into that module, but it's worth looking through it. It's pretty simple. But again, so that's the clean URLs. For sake of time, I want to move on. Next in the stack is something we call broker. And here, I'll pull up this module. It's a module anyone can use. Again, it's on NPM as a middleware. Basically, what broker does is it's kind of like deliver. What deliver does is it either serves local files or it proxies remote files. What broker does is it uses deliver under the hood, and it lets you be a static file server, with no clean URLs or anything. It's basically using the Express's .static when it used to be in Express, And if you just say this is a local folder here, it'll serve it like just static files locally as a middleware. But if you pass it a remote URL, your Express app now becomes a proxy, which is really helpful for things like Superstatic when we don't know if we're going to be serving local files or remote files, because the goal in the future with Superstatic is to have these separate modules and to provide what we call file store providers. So we want you in Superstatic to we want you to be able to serve local files from S3, files from Dropbox, files from Rackspace, or wherever you keep your files. We want you to be able to just say, I want to use this file store provider, and it works for you. We're not there yet. We're working on that, but this broker module is the start of it. And I can kind of show you how it works real quick. Again, we do a lot of jumping through hoops because we have to do a lot of parsing of the URL. We have to join the root current working directory. That could be a local directory or a remote directory right here, again, using that join module. Then we have to determine, is this a directory index, or so on and so forth, because then we need to parse, do we serve the index.html file, or do we skip this module if it's not even an index.html or a directory index file. But anyways, we do a lot of parsing here. We combine, we build the URL. we have to get the MIME type because with clean URLs, one of the headaches we found this week was that on IE8 and 9, if you don't set the content type for a clean URL, it assumes that it's a downloadable file, and you get that octet stream. So we have to parse from the extension the MIME type, so that when we serve clean URLs, this is something I forgot to mention earlier, we have to set it to text HTML so that browsers like IE8 and IE9 can best handle that. And that was actually a huge bug we encountered this past week that we had no idea about. And you know,
how the IE bugs go.
Yeah, you know, we got to fix this week. It took a little while, but you know, one of the downsides to having all these modules is you got to do a bunch of npm links in order to use them together to test locally, and it becomes a headache. But overall, it's easy. Again, so it's using this deliver module again. If it's local, it's just going to use just like the send module. It's just going to serve the static file. That's what broker is. And if it's remote, it's going to proxy that file for you. And moving on, and here's my favorite one. It uses something we titled static router, and I'll show you it on npm because you can use it in your local Connector Express app if you want to. It's just a middleware that you pass in some globs as keys and values. And if it matches this route, it's going to serve this file. If it matches this route, which is the default for like a push state type thing, it'll serve this file. And it's just really cool to be able to do stuff like this. And I'm just really surprised that there was no other module like that. And this is really the heart of why Superstatic was born anyways, was because of things like this. We want to be able to, you know, serve a certain file on a certain route. And I'll kind of show you real quick on, let me find it, static router right here. In this file, it's really simple. It's just using that globject module again to parse out the route that it should serve, the file it should serve, and then it serves that file. It's just as simple as that right here. We use globject and we say, you know, does this URL match this glob? And if it does, serve the file that is the value of that glob. And it's just awesome. It's really simple. It's straightforward. And then and it serves it again using deliver module. Again, there's that slash module to add the slashes. You're going to see these all over Superstatic. And it just made it a lot easier. But this static router just is been phenomenal for Superstatic and for our use developing front-end applications. And again, here's that if statement again. You've seen it up here, if clean URLs. You've seen it up here. If having these guard clauses in front of these middlewares have given us a significant performance increase. And that's an obvious thing. Having less code means, you know, less things to do. And then once we're past this, see, you see here end test for empty configuration. I'm going to jump back up here, and I skipped it on purpose. Right up here, you see this is empty config. If our configuration value is ever empty, we don't want our server to have to deal with any of this stuff. We want it to skip all of it. Again, adding this guard clause gave us about a 10% performance increase about skipping all this stuff. So I don't mind having these nested if statements if it gives me those performance increases. And I get that there's probably great ways to abstract that out and have factories and stuff, but you know, we're just not there yet. This is easy enough to follow along that it's not worth our time to refactor it yet. So, and once you get past all of that right there that we just went through was the meat of Superstatic. Once you get past that, we're just serving a default favicon, which we have a Divshot one. If you go to anything Divshot like the Superstatic site, it's just this default favicon. Or if you, in Superstatic, when you configure it programmatically, you can say, I want this favicon to be served. Or in your application, if you're using Superstatic from the command line, whatever, if you have a favicon.ico, it'll serve that. So, I mean, typical. And then the very last thing in our chain is the not found page, obviously. And this was the biggest headache because we had to parse, do you have a custom error page or do we serve our default error page? And not only that, is it a remote URL? Is it a local URL? Do we have to parse from our file hash, as I said earlier, from Divshot hosting? This continues to be our biggest headache, which you wouldn't think it would be. But and I'll show you. It's actually a module you can look at on npm. I was surprised that this module name was available. Really simple. I mean, there's other modules that do the same thing. You just pass in whatever your not found file is, or your error page file is as a middleware. But the reason we had to write our own again was because we're serving remote files as well. So we need to do a lot of this parsing. We need to see, is this a URL? Does this file exist? And if this file exists, does it exist locally? And it seems kind of redundant to do both, but for our sake, because we're proxying remote files for Divshot hosting, we had to override the file exists function to read through a hash of files to see if that file exists rather than just reading it locally. And again, a lot of this headache will go away when we have these file store providers I mentioned earlier, where these file store providers kind of handle these type of file checking. So we just pass in a provider, and then every module will just use a provider .exist type of thing.
Is that the bundles thing you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, well, no, bundles. Here, let me show you bundles for the sake of education. This bundles module is awesome. So what bundles does is it lets you create a standalone sets of middleware, and then you can inject that middleware into Express or Connect or whatever you want to use. But it also lets you name the middleware and then do a use before or use after. So if you have like this isolated set of middleware that you have no access to the code, if you need to do something before it or after it, you can use this to do it. And just last week, it provided this on-response method I threw in there that lets you pass a callback, and it lets you intercept the response and tweak it, and whatever you return from it is what the response is. So you're basically doing kind of a map type thing, so that if, again, you have this set of middleware that you have no access to, but you need to do something to the response before it gets sent to the client, you can intercept it and do stuff like that. And that module itself is not in here yet. It's actually in the it'll come out with the 2.0, because that function alone on response is going to get rid of half the code we have to put into Superstatic in order to use it for Divshot, which I'm really excited about. But again, this is just a typical module. You know, it's using the deliver thing. If you have a local file, it's going to stream a local file. If you have a remote file, it's going to proxy the remote file for you. Becomes super helpful. For testing purposes, at this point, we don't actually serve the files. We have this kind of test mode you can pass in, and it just returns the stack, so we can do various assertions against the stack itself. Again, because I said earlier that the order of the middleware in this stack is as important as the logic in each middleware. Because if you put something like a routes, if you put this router, the static router, before the actual serving of the static files, then you'll never get to your static files, because the route will always intercept it if it matches. And that became a headache that we had to solve earlier. So the order of these, we actually have to do a type of integration test to test the order, which I'm not a huge fan of unit tests that know how the logic works. But for the sake of sanity and not breaking something, we had to write tests like that. But if you're not in test mode, this is where it actually it doesn't actually run the stack here, but it builds the bundle. And this stack is actually what runs here. If you jump back to right here, this stack is actually run here. And Connect doesn't know any better. It thinks it's just running a single middleware. But really what we've done is we've combined all of our middleware into one middleware so that we can use it there, which makes it useful to use Superstatic in like as a middleware, or just the idea of building stacks upon stacks upon stacks really help you isolate different functionality into one middleware instead of having to build these giant sets of middleware in one spot. So, and that's the meat of how Superstatic works. There's a lot more code we can go deeper into, like I said, the services or the file stores or the settings, but I don't think that they're actually that fun to jump into. because they do jump through some hoops. One last file I did want to jump into, though. But before I do, is there any more questions kind of about the stack?
Sort of unrelated question is, you guys seem to have like a really tight understanding on the performance of your code here. Is that something you automate, your performance testing?
Yeah, so if you jump into, let me go into our closed issues, label, research. So this was a long-standing type of, here's one. These are the performance automations. We don't have it automated anymore, but we were using this work method here you guys can look up. And these were our tests for, these were our performance tests for, do we stack all the middleware at the beginning, or is it okay that we stack it on each request? And this proved that it didn't really matter. One other one we had was this express versus connect, which is where we got a lot of our performance results. And I tested connect versus express, and it showed that it really didn't have any kind of impact on it. But we started to get a lot of interest from these guys at Roots at Carrot that were working on Roots, because they were really interested in, there's a long conversation here. They were really interested in this performance too, and in the end, it didn't really matter, and we didn't see Express as something that was actually helpful. It wasn't hurtful, but it wasn't helpful, so it wasn't worth us trying to drop in Express, and it was kind of a bigger module to throw in there, so we stuck with Connect. But we don't yet have any type of automation as far as performance. What we do have, and I'm thankful a contributor to Superstatic did this for us. We do have an npm run audit if you install Superstatic locally, and it will audit our modules in Superstatic to see if there's any vulnerabilities, and it does it with the NSP module here, and it against the node security database, which is really cool. And one other one he kind of introduced was the outdated as well. So those are kind of automated. And when we run our tests on Travis CI for Superstatic, it runs the audit. So it doesn't fail if there's any vulnerable modules, but we can go back and look and see if there are any vulnerable modules. So, and it does automate the tests when we push up to GitHub. It does run it on Travis. And as you saw on the README, we've got these badges here that let you know latest version is the build passing, and it runs. I'm not a huge code climate fan. I don't know that it could read code and say, this is good code, but we put it on there because it makes people feel better.
Cool.
So yeah, that's kind of a long answer to your question. So was there anything else before I jump into the last file?
Yeah, one of our listeners has asked if can we see an example of the config file that you might typically use?
That's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. So I have. This is usually my test application. I have a bunch of stuff in here, but here's what a typical configuration file for superstatic.json would look like. Again, you name. This is a divshot.json file, so you don't necessarily need a name. We have the name so that you can push it with a deployment. But here's where you set your root directory. You don't even need this, but it defaults to that. You can set it to stuff like this, and it will be relative to this directory now. So clean URLs. Here's that array again of globs. This isn't necessarily a glob, but you can do stuff like that. Or you can actually just set it to true, and it'll treat every HTML URL and make it a clean URL. Here's the redirects globs. Again, you can do stuff like this. I want all these HTML files to redirect to that. Here's the routes configuration. Pretty straightforward again. This would be a glob, and it would serve this file. I don't know what that shouldn't be in there. Here's a exclude. This isn't necessarily for Superstatic, but when you're deploying to Divshot, you don't necessarily want to deploy your entire node modules folder. So you can throw in some exclude files there. Here's the caching again. For the sake of my testing purposes, so it's easier for me, I just said I don't want anything to cache. So I set it to false. Here's the headers configuration. Here's the error page. It's just, again, it's a URL relative to whatever your root directory is. And out on the Superstatic website, again, here's all the things you can put into that file. But that's an example of kind of how you would do it. The only thing you need, and you don't even need a superstatic file to get started with it. So if I run into this directory here, it has a superstatic file. But if you have it installed globally, if you install it, pm install superstatic. If you install it globally, you can just run the superstatic function, kind of start up the server, really simple. And now I can go to localhost. This is just my test file that lets me do a bunch of stuff. But you don't even need a config file. It just works for you. That was the whole goal with Superstatic, is I want to start working on an HTML file. How do I get around the headache of the file : / in
That's
my
awesome.
browser? So we even have an alias SS, which is even easier. So, all right.
I noticed too, real quick. I'm sorry, but
That's
you have the latest version of Connect on there. What version of Node do you recommend?
Well, I mean, you can run 0.11 if you want, but we haven't gotten any complaints on 0.8, but everything we do is on 0.10. And I would assume that most people that are going to be using this aren't in the enterprise, so they're probably running 0.10. And so that's just what we support, you know.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions on the stack or any of those middlewares? Nope. All right, cool. The last thing I kind of wanted to look at was this CLI file, because the most basic use of Superstatic, and the one we really push, is for the command line. Is how do I just get going? And like I showed you, you can just run that command and you get going. And you can also, you got flags if you want to run it on a different port. You can do stuff like that. If you have a different configuration file, you can do this, and you can name your, configuration file. So if you don't want to use superstatic.json, whatever. And it's really helpful. And that type of stuff really helped because, we have a grunt Divshot module that really uses Superstatic under the hood that lets you configure all that type of stuff with grunt. But the CLI file was really interesting because I'm not a real fan of any of the CLI modules on NPM. There's a lot of them like Flatiron or Commander that you can use, but they never really made it easy to write commands and flags for a CLI module. So what we did is we wrote our own. I just called it Nash, kind of like Node and Bash. That's just what came to mind at the time. And it just allows you to create the CLI. These are for the sake of the help file, but we just throw in kind of these settings, these default settings into the CLI. But what I wanted to show you in here is that we've got a lot of gross stuff in here, and I actually wanted to show off how bad this code is. And it works really well, but in the
awesome.
The Superstatic 2.0 that's going to come out is the push for that, like I said before, is going to be middleware and not so much a standalone server. Now, it'll have a standalone server, but we're really going to push it as a middleware because we really want to be able to. Configuring it as a middleware really reduces the amount of extra code we have to put in for the multi-tenant use we need in production, which will make it a lot easier for running it as a command line, because really all I'm going to do in the command line is create an express server and inject this as a middleware. But here what we got to do is we got to do all these parsings that we shouldn't have to do, that we have to pass into Superstatic like this. But a lot of that will be handled within Superstatic. But what I wanted to show you was this module real quick, which really helped us with our Divshot CLI and Superstatic to make it so that we can have simple things like a help file like this automatically generated from the commands we do. So this awesome Nash module, it's not documented at all because I haven't put much love into it. But if you just type in CLI.flag and you do C. You can do as many as you want. These are all the aliases, and it's .handler. And now what you've done, I know I misspelled function here. Now what you've done is this gets run anytime it catches that flag. It's really simple. And if you put exit is true, now if that flag is there, it'll stop after this flag. Just stuff like that made it really simple. Another one we did was CLI.command. So when you see like on Superstatic's a bad example, but when like on the Divshot CLI, when you're pushing, if the push method, you know, now we can just do this this command. But the cool thing about this module is that I can just add as many aliases as I want, like this, and all of them just work. And whatever, and it does some weird magic injection stuff. So if I put like a variable here, it'll know to look for that. So if I'm doing like divshot.push and then I list the environment, it'll know to parse this environment into this variable. Anyways, my point in showing you all that is that the CLI was actually one of the more difficult parts, obviously behind the slashes and the clean URLs, because there wasn't anything that made it really easy to write reusable code. And so we have the CLI file, and now it's fully testable, which is awesome because this Nash module, it's not documented, but it really makes it easy to test. So if we jump into our CLI tests here, we can create a CLI and tell it not to really do anything, but it lets us run it. And we don't have a lot of time left. We've already been talking for an hour and a half, but it lets you emulate running the CLI, which helped us really wrap tests around our Superstatic CLI so that we can trust what's out on NPM is tested and it works well. So go ahead. Someone going to say something?
Oh.
Okay. Anyway, so that's basically how Superstatic works. So is there any questions? Anything that wasn't clear? Anything you want to know?
Actually, I think you did a really incredible job. This was amazingly clear. So, anybody else have any questions before we wrap it up?
No, I don't think so. That was great.
Actually, I'm looking forward to. I'm glad we're.
Yeah, that was great. Sorry to have so many questions there.
I'm looking forward to going back and looking at this again and kind of dissecting it, because I think this project is probably a really good case study in why it's good to reinvent the wheel, because you get all these little tiny improvements in rough, dark corners that add up to something really big, and you've done a good job of explaining it. So thanks for coming and spending the time with us.
Yeah, really, we had a great opportunity. I appreciate it. And I just want to encourage you guys or anyone else, please tell me how bad it is so that we can make it better. As you're looking through the code, please find what is disgusting and make recommendations on how to make it better, because we don't get offended. We get offended if people tell us it's awesome, because then that means they're not really looking at it. So
this is great, because actually one thing that we'd love to encourage with these Hangouts is for more people to contribute to open source software. So
yeah, I just think it's really cool what you guys are doing to push open source. I know one of the greatest hurdles I had into coming into open source was I didn't know what a contributing document was. I didn't really know how to make a pull request, and I got yelled at by a lot of maintainers because I did it wrong, and I just didn't know to look. And I think what you guys are doing here is really educational for the open source community. And because I'm passionate for it, I'm just really thankful for you guys. So just thank you for this opportunity, but more thank you for having this podcast. And I really hope it becomes something that changes the shape of open source.
Oh, wow, that's very kind. Do you have anything that you'd like potential contributors to know about? If somebody wanted to submit a pull request, do they need a contributor's license agreement or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Kind of what I would say here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Are we done there? Kind of what I would say is, don't let anything hold you back. Just kind of do it. Submit a pull request, even if it's something we won't support. We'll try to figure out a way to put it into something that makes it awesome for you. And usually, if someone's submitting a pull request or has an issue or wants a feature, that means it's something that needs to go into Superstatic. So the cool thing about Superstatic is, if you're going to submit a pull request or open an issue about a feature, it's probably going to get implemented. So just do it.
Awesome. Do you wanna plug Divshot? Anything people should know about Divshot?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you go and look at Divshot, what you get for free is awesome. It's kind of like the Heroku type of business model, but you get a lot of stuff for free that is really, really helpful, and it really changed my life. I can't possibly imagine working on an application that has a front end or an API without Divshot now. There are other solutions out there, but in our opinion, we provide the easiest deployment and the most configuration. So I'm really thankful for it. It solves a lot of problems we have. So yeah, that's it. So divshot.com, and it's Divshot on GitHub, Divshot on Twitter.
And how can people reach you if they have any questions?
Yeah, my recommendation, you can hit me up on Twitter, but GitHub on anything. I mean, if you have any questions about any modules I'm working on, there's a lot out there. Yeah, and I'm really fast to respond. So yeah.
That's great.
Awesome. That was a lot of fun. Thanks,
So
guys.
it's at Scott Corgan.
Yes, I'm basically Scott Corgan on everything. So.
Great.
Yeah.
One other thing too is, I mean, Divshot's blog is pretty cool to go through. A lot of good stuff on web components.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of new stuff that's going to be coming out the next couple weeks, or next few weeks about web components. In fact, Divshot, we run a web components meetup, the only one we know about in this area, so in LA. So if anyone sees us and they're in LA, you can look up Web Components LA on meetup.com, and we'd love to educate you.
And when's the next Static Showdown?
That is the question, isn't it? You know, around the same time as the last one. The problem we're facing is the Super Bowl really ruins everything that time of year. So it's around that time, and it's going to be better than ever. That was quite overwhelming last year.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
So
Awesome.
before we go, just one more thing. We just launched our little website for this, where all the videos are going to be archived. It's readthesource.io. And in a couple of weeks, I just got an email confirmation. We're going to have Chris Matthew is going to read us some Skynet code.
Nice.
So that's pretty exciting.
Oh yes. Control all of the robot things.
Yeah. So that's pretty great. That one made me smile. It's good.
Nice.
All right, guys. Thanks so much.
All right.
Thank you again.
Thanks, guys. Later.
All right.
Later.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.